Mental Survival, the channel where we talk about the psychological aspects of prepping and survivalism. My name is Cliff Hamrick, and today we're going to be finishing up our series on the primary emotions. Just as a recap, the four primary emotions are fear, anger, happiness, and sadness. And we call them the primary emotions because these are basically the four emotions that your brain generates, and from those, all other emotions will arise. Today we're going to be talking about sadness. And sadness is an interesting emotion. I believe it's probably the last emotion to have evolved. There's a little bit of a, I don't know, chicken and egg theory of do you have to be happy before you can be sad, or do you have to be sad before you can be happy? But I think those two definitely go together. If you remember from our previous discussions, emotions are basically just information. And the information that sadness gives us is that we have lost something. We have lost something that feels important to us. Notice I said it feels important to us. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is important. It just feels important. And the severity of that loss will kind of help dictate the severity of the sadness. Sadness can be something very brief. And in fact, all emotions, if you let them, will be fairly brief. They will come up, they'll provide their information, and they'll go away. If we hang on to them, though, they will stick around. So, like some very temporary instances of sadness is like listening to a sad song, or watching a sad movie, or even just a sad commercial. What we end up doing is we kind of empathize with what we're seeing or we're hearing, and it begins to bring up feelings of sadness from ourselves. So, for instance, if we listen to a song about two people breaking up, they were in love and now they're breaking up, that's the loss of a relationship. We hear the song, we're moved by the music, we resonate with the lyrics, and then we also feel sad as well. How long that sadness sticks around or how intense it is depends on other things. If we have recently lost a relationship of our own, and this song reminds us exactly of that same situation, then that sadness can be fairly intense. Whereas if we just sort of broke up with people, a while in the past, and the song doesn't really relate to us, or we don't feel like it relates to us, then that sadness might pass just as quickly as when the next song comes on, and nothing more than that. But if you remember, emotions will fade if we let them, but they'll hang around if we put our energy into it. So, for instance, in this case, if we're listening to a sad song about someone who's broken up, and that causes us to remember a breakup that we've had, we start to dwell on it, how much it hurt, how much we missed the person, how much we start imagining all the lost opportunities, we start imagining all the other things that could have happened. We can stay sad for a while, for hours, for days. The song will be long over. The actual stimulus of the emotion is now gone, but because we're kind of dwelling on this, we keep feeding this, we stay sad and we stay stuck. And this concept of staying stuck is going to kind of be a part of the rest of the video. But sadness itself can be very brief and short and not very intense. The next level of intensity of sadness is more like grief. This is a case in which we've lost something that's important to us, but that loss is permanent. We will never get it back. Now, typically when we talk about grief, we're usually talking about the loss of a person, of a loved one. So a husband, a wife, a grandparent, a parent, this sort of loss. We miss these people. They're now dead. They're not going to come back. We're never going to see them again. And our lives from this point on is going to be totally different because we're never going to get that loss back. But we don't also just have to mourn the loss of people. We can mourn the loss of animals. We've found that the human brain responds to pets pretty much the same way we respond to children. And so the loss of a pet can be just as devastating as the loss of a child. And so if you or someone has lost a pet, if they've had to put them down, or if they disappeared, or they're killed some other way, and you're grieving over that, you're not being silly. You're not overreacting. That is a real, genuine feeling. They are someone who's important to you, and now they're gone, and they're never going to come back. We can also grieve the loss of people we've never met. As of this recording, it's in 2016, and this year we've lost a lot of famous people. The first two that come to mind is like Prince and David Bowie, but I know there's been a long list of others. A lot of people have really grieved the loss of those celebrities, even though they've never met them. They may have never even gone to like a David Bowie concert, but they've heard the music. The music was important to them. It meant something to them, and this person now being dead hurts them in a way, even though they've never actually met them. So grief can take in a lot of forms. It can also be the loss of other aspects of life events, life-changing events. So someone who has lost their job could be grieving that job. They could be grieving going to that workplace, being with those people, the money that they were making. It might be even a big part of their identity. Maybe they're an engineer and they worked as an engineer, and now they've lost their job and now they're not an engineer anymore, and part of them is wondering, well, if I'm not an engineer, then who am I? What do I do? That sort of thing. I think that's one of the reasons why for some people retirement is not a good idea, because a big part of their identity is working, and if they're not working, then who are they? What do they do? What do they do with their time? My grandfather fell in that category. I think he would have been much happier if he had just dropped dead at work rather than retiring and then spending, I think it was like 10 or 15 years of just sitting around the house doing nothing. I think he was a lot more depressed in retirement than he ever was when he was working. But grief doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing or come from a bad place. A young couple getting married for the first time will grieve their loss of independence, their freedom, their singleness, if you will. Young parents of their first child will grieve their loss of freedom. They're happy about the new child coming in, but they're also going to grieve a lot of the freedom that kind of comes with not having kids. Now everything will be a little more difficult. Just going to the grocery store with a toddler is very difficult. So any of these situations can be grief, can cause us to grieve. Again, to different levels of intensity for different reasons. But the main things to remember with grief is, one, grief is perfectly normal and natural. There's nothing wrong with you because you're grieving. And you get to decide what you're grieving and why. No one else gets to tell you. The fact that it was just your dog and he just died and he was really old and what are you crying about, that doesn't matter. That's not their dog. This is your dog. And so you get to grieve however you want. Someone who is grieving over a lost marriage, even if it was like an abusive marriage, even if they weren't really happy, the fact that you were married and no longer are married, you're allowed to grieve that however you want. Grief also doesn't really have a timeline. I don't really believe that grief is something that you just really get over. I don't consider that my job as a counselor is to help my clients get over their grief. I look at it this way. My job is to make it to where the client can now remember what they've lost and it doesn't really hurt so much. But the notion that they're just going to get over it and it's never going to bother them again is kind of ridiculous, I think. Especially when someone has lost a child. From what I've been told, a parent losing his child is something they never really quite get over. And it doesn't even matter at the age. I've worked with clients who they were older, they're in their 50s or 60s, and their adult children died for a variety of reasons. And that still hit them hard. So this isn't even like a 5-year-old dying. This is like a 35-year-old dying. And that still hits them really hard. I consider my job as a counselor is to help someone get through the grieving process so that way it doesn't turn into depression. Because if you leave it alone, it can turn to depression. And depression is the most extreme form of sadness. And you want to avoid depression as much as possible. Like I said, grief is natural and normal, and it's a process that one has to go through. Depression is not something that you want to go through. That's not a healthy situation, because what depression does, in a way, is it makes you sort of obsess on the sadness. All you can do is focus on what you don't have, how things aren't working, all the ways in which your life didn't go quite right. And then because there's nothing you can do about those things, because remember, this is a loss, so it's something that's happened in the past, then the brain gets stuck on how nothing will ever work, nothing will ever be better, nothing will ever be right. And that really can keep people stuck. Because if you remember from our happiness video, to be happy, you have to do something. This has to be actions that you're taking, or even just changing the way you're thinking about a situation. But you have to do something to be happy. Depression, however, because it undercuts all of that, it saps your motivation, saps your will to try and make change or try and do anything different. Then what happens is you just stop wanting to try stuff. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Depression, once you're in it, kind of keeps you stuck. It's a lot like momentum. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. Same thing with depression. Once you kind of get in that rut, it's really hard to get out of it, because all the things that you would want to do to get out of it, you don't feel the motivation to do it. You don't even see the point in trying. You don't even see the point in doing anything. This is the reason why in almost all the survival books that you read or anything else like that, they talk about why you have to maintain a positive outlook. Is because if you get stuck in depression, nothing else matters. It doesn't matter how well trained you are. It doesn't matter how much gear you have. It doesn't matter how good your situation is. If you're depressed, you're not going to try anything. Maybe you found yourself lost out in the wilderness, and you're near a lake so you could fish. There's plenty of materials to build a shelter. Maybe you have a cigarette lighter so you could start a fire very easily. You have a water bottle so you can purify your water. In survivalism terms, you're doing pretty good. But if depression tells you this is too hard, you're not going to do it, who cares, what's the point, this is, it's not the perfect situation, then you won't try any of those things. You won't have to do any of those things, because a survival situation, by definition, is difficult. You're going to meet difficulties, and you're going to have problems actually overriding them, even if it's just a minor thing. It's an easy solve, but once you meet that resistance, depression kicks in, tells you, well, just give up. And that's why sometimes we hear about people who should survive, but they don't. They just sit down underneath a tree and they just die. So what I tell my clients when it comes to depression, of course, whether this is in a survival situation or just in their everyday life and modern life, the way to fight depression is just to fight depression. Depression is a relentless enemy, and it is your enemy. It is not you. It's not part of you. It is something else. It is a way in which your brain is becoming stuck, or it's becoming broken, or whatever else, however you like to conceive of it. But your depression is not you. It is an enemy, and all it wants you to do is to sit down and die and give up. And so what you have to do is everything but that. So if you feel stuck and you're, like, we'll use a survival situation, for instance, you should probably build a shelter, but there's really not good materials around where you're at in order to build a shelter. And depression says, well, I guess that's it. I guess we're not just going to have a shelter. What you do is you get up and you go out and you try and find materials. You find whatever scraps of trash you can and you build something from that. Whatever it is depression is telling you to do, sit down, give up, don't try, whatever, you do the opposite. And whatever little thing you can do, you do that. Whatever little energy you can muster, whatever little motivation you can muster, you do that. So if depression says just lay down and take a nap and go to sleep and maybe it'll all be over with when before you know it, then you do the opposite. You go sit and you just listen to the birds sing. You look at the stars. These things are not necessarily going to keep you alive, so to speak, but they can change your mental outlook. And maybe that's the first thing you need to do before you even try and build a shelter or anything else, is try and change your mental outlook and start focusing on the things that you can do instead of the things that you can't do. Because depression wants you to just focus on all the ways in which things won't work. And this is how sadness can really morph into depression. Grief, like I said, can morph into depression as well. And oftentimes in a survival situation, you're going to have a lot of reasons to grieve. Perhaps we're in a plane crash or some sort of car crash. Maybe someone you're with is dead. They've died. You've actually watched them die. Maybe you don't even know where they are. Maybe they're just lost along with you. That's kind of a real reason to grieve over that person. You might grieve over your loss of safety. Perhaps just knowing that you don't know where you are and you don't have a shelter and you don't have a way of being found or anything else, that's going to cause you to feel unsafe, which is also, of course, going to cause panic, which is another emotion that you want to keep under wraps as well. So my recommendation is when you find yourself in a situation like this, is allow yourself to grieve, because you want to just feel the feelings, let them pass, and let them get past you. And how you want to grieve is going to be different for each person. Sometimes sitting down and just having a really good cry is exactly what you need to do. And I don't care how big burly man you are, if you feel like crying, let it go. Because if that's what it takes to get the grieving process out of your system, do that. The last thing you want to do is hold on to it and let that maybe morph into depression. If you need to bury the dead, do that. If you need to have like a little memorial service, do that. Say a prayer over someone. That's fine too. Whatever it is to just sort of acknowledge the loss that you're feeling, but letting yourself move past it is really important. Like I said, you don't want to stay stuck and dwell on the things that you've lost, because in a survival situation, you may have a lot of things to lose. So that's the dangers of depression and sadness in a survival situation. And of course, this happens in modern life all the time. Modern life has plenty of reasons to make us feel sad and depressed and grieve over things as well. Of course, the difference is most of the things that we grieve over in modern life really don't affect our survival. And so that's definitely one of the things that I tell my clients to do, is to start do what I call a caveman inventory. Is the things that a caveman would want, the caveman would need is shelter, food, water, clean water, some kind of activities to sort of keep their mental capacity going, and then some sort of companionship. If you have those 5 things from a caveman perspective, you're good. You're golden. And for most Americans, we can get those 5 things. Even if you've lost a job, we have unemployment. We have ways of doing it. We have food banks. We have water's dirt cheap. Maybe someone will turn off your electricity and your cable, but you don't really need those. You do need some sort of entertainment, but you can go buy cheap books somewhere off of Amazon or half-price books or something else. You can play games. You can even just start hobbies and things. But once you can really acknowledge that you've met your caveman needs, and you really celebrate those, so to speak, then that can kind of push sadness away, push grief away, push depression away, and remind you the stuff that you do have. Because like I said, sadness and depression try and get you to focus on the stuff that you don't have, and that can be a bottomless pit, and it really doesn't actually help you get out of the situation. So acknowledging it is one thing. Dwelling on it is not healthy. Again, I always say, with meditation, through mindfulness meditation, you become more aware of your thoughts, more aware of your feelings. And so when natural, normal, healthy grief and sadness starts to morph into depression, if you've been meditating and you're more aware of what's going on inside you, then you're more likely to catch it, and then you're more likely to do something before it gets really, really bad. You can do something about it before depression gets too deep, and then you really are just sitting around doing nothing, hoping the world will fix itself. So anyway, this was sadness for this week. Next week we'll be talking about belief systems and other situations, and moving on into different topics. Again, I'll have my Facebook link down in the description. I also have my Patreon account, should you ever decide you want to donate to my account. And I will see y'all next time. Thanks. Bye.